Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's BSL Talks webinar on work care and social security, making it work for children and families. My name's Dina Bowman. I'm Principal Research Fellow in the Work and Economic Security team at the Brotherhood of St. Laurence. Today, I'm speaking to you from Wadawurrung country in regional Victoria. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and waterways. I pay respect to elders, past, present, and emerging, and to all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders from the lands on which you're joining us and who are with us today. Our panellists are joining us from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, Ngunnawal people, and the Gubbi Gubbi people. Before we commence our discussion, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping things. We welcome Chelsea and Naomi, our Auslan interpreters, and closed captioning is available at the bottom of the screen by clicking the CC or closed caption button. There's also a Q&A feature, so if you've got a question, pop it in the Q&A place, and if you want to make a comment, just add that to the chat and we'll be able to keep an eye on them. Don't forget to tag us at Brotherhood Info and use the hashtag BSL Talks if you're tweeting. Today's webinar will also be recorded, so if you need to drop out or you drop out, the internet doesn't work, you can pick it up later on. It'll be published on our website. And if you've registered for the event, we'll email you with the link to that recording. So let's get into it. We've got a lot to discuss. Really, when we think about it, in the 1980s, in 1987, Prime Minister Bob Hawke made the commitment that no child would, or the promise that no child would live in poverty by 1990. And there were some really, as Bettina will attest, there were some measures that really made a difference, but many of those measures were unwound. So now there are 1 in 6 children living in poverty, children in sole parent families, most of whom are women, headed by women, are more than 3 times as likely to live in poverty as children in couple families. So what's going on and how do we tackle child and family poverty? We're joined by a distinguished panel of experts to tease out these issues and highlight what changes are needed to improve the economic security of women and children. We have Emeritus Professor Bettina Cass, AO, who is an Australian sociologist and social policy scholar at the University of New South Wales and the University of Sydney. And Bettina we're particularly pleased for Bettina to be here today because she's been unwell. And so we're very pleased for her to make the effort to participate. We have Professor Peter Whiteford, who's Professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. And we have Paulene, who is an advocate and expert by experience. So first of all, Bettina, as I mentioned, there was a lot of movement around child poverty in the 80s. So following the 1987 review of the social security system that you chaired, I understand, some important reforms were introduced for low-income families, including those on income support and those with jobs. Since then, so I noted, many of those reforms have been undone. Can you reflect on some of the key changes and challenges over that period?
Certainly, and thank you for the invitation. And I would like personally to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on which I sit today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd like to apologise for the quality of my voice. I am 3 days out of COVID isolation. Not a happy circumstance, as I'm sure those of you who've had it will attest. Well, I'd like to begin very quickly by saying today we heard from the 2021 census data that we're getting that there are more than 1 million sole parent families in Australia, which is an important increase. I'd like to also suggest that although we have a focus on sole parent families, it is not sufficient to do that. We must focus on all low-income families with children, because there appears to be a correlation between being in a low-income family, in a couple family, and if there is their movement into being in a low-income sole parent family. So when we think about policy design, we have to take that into account if we are to take seriously the Hawke government's pledge to end, and certainly in our time, to design policies which improve both the circumstances of parents in low-income families and the circumstances of their children. In 1987, a new family allowance supplement for low-income families with children, those in employment and those in receipt of income support, was received. And I think that's policy lesson number one. That is to ensure that all policy initiatives are provided for both those in paid work and those out of paid work, making the situation of the parents and particularly of the children the uppermost consideration. And most importantly, the family allowance supplement then increased payments for families with children to 15% of the married rate of pension for children up to the age of 12 and 20% of age pension for children aged 13 years and above. This introduced for the first time indexation for child payments and pegged them to the rate of pension, which in most times, from time to time, were the age pension was indexed to the male average weekly earnings. Therefore, child payments were indexed to an index of community standards, which has been seriously eroded. Uniform rent assistance for families in private rental housing was provided to all Social Security recipients with children, and again to low-income families in paid work. And importantly, I believe, all child-related payments were made to the principal carer of the children, almost always the mother. And also, very importantly, in 1989, the Jobs, Education and Training Program, JET, was introduced for sole parents to enable them, and I stress voluntarily and without sanctions for non-compliance, to increase their education and training qualifications and their employment capacities. Education, training and free or highly subsidised and affordable childcare were also provided. And the objective was to enhance the employment capacities of sole parents and their entry to decent, adequately paid, secure jobs. JET affected in a positive direction the lives of close to 1 million people, mainly sole mothers and their children. And the effects of these changes, as Peter Whiteford on the panel and Peter Saunders of the SPRC estimated in 1987, was to reduce poverty rates for families in receipt of income support. They did not look at the numbers of children in families that were in paid work, because that was difficult to ascertain the take-up rate of the new changes. But they estimated that the reduction in poverty would be by 19%, and the reduction in the poverty gap would be by 45%. And a later estimate by the OECD using a 50% of median income poverty line found that between 1984 and 1994, child poverty in Australia fell by 50% amongst non-employed single parents and by 80% among non-employed couple parents with children. And what does this tell us? It tells us that poverty and reducing substantially poverty in families with children is a policy choice. That's the important issue. It is a policy choice by governments, because what happened after that, if you want me to go on, if you want Peter to say what happened after that, I'm quite happy. Because what happened after that was a reduction in the value, the mode of indexation of what became called family tax benefit parts A and B from the year 2000, and also for the reduction in the rates for parenting payment, because that was what the major form of income support for sole parents and low-income parents is now called. And also of extreme importance, the movement on the basis of a notion of from welfare to work, of removing parenting payment from families with children, sole parent families with children, when the youngest child turned 8, and in couple parent families with children when the youngest child turned 6, effectively moving unemployed parents in requiring income support onto the then New Start allowance and now job seeker, which of course is seriously lower in its rates, harsher in its income testing, much harsher in its work testing than parenting payment. This is an extremely important issue, and it's one that good governance is required for altering the direction in which these issues are moving.
Thanks, Bettina. As you say, there's the lessons of the past show that policy can really make a difference, and as you said, make a significant difference to child poverty. Much has changed, you know, there's been some unwinding the focus of on employment and perhaps an obscuring of the importance of parenting and care. Peter, could you reflect on some of the changes around labour market participation of women, which has increased since the 80s, but still there's that pattern, persistent pattern of women doing the bulk of the care?
Yes, thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. There have been some very significant changes over time, and many people will already know this, of course, in the labour force participation of women. I think it particularly accelerated after the late 1990s. Now, that's had, as Bettina mentioned, there were very significant changes to the conditions under which low-income parents could get benefits. It started in 2006, was announced the year before, which seemed for a bit of time to have accelerated those trends, although since 2009 and the global financial crisis, that acceleration stopped. But so what happened is that the share of lone parents who were in employment and not relying on social security payments for their main source of income increased very significantly. But of course, that there are also costs associated with working. So there's the childcare costs for people with young children, and also after school care, obviously, for people with older children. Then there's also the extra time pressure that's, I think, particularly significant for parents who who have sole responsibility for children. So they have to both work, pick up their children after either childcare or school and drop them off, and do all of the housework as well. So the time pressures have probably increased. But if we look at the sort of the share of people in employment, that's certainly has continued to increase. I was just looking, in addition to the census, the figures that Bettina referred to, but they haven't come out yet with the full details of that people like us academics like to see. But there was a survey of the labour force status of families with children almost exactly at the same time as the census, and what you have currently is about, I think it's about, there's still around 500,000 children living in families where there's nobody in the household is in paid employment. So those families are the most disadvantaged. They don't have any earnings coming into the household. But in addition, there's also this extra pressure on families who do have earnings, and a lot of whom have part-time earnings, as you said, because of the time pressures. Sort of that a lot of parents, particularly mothers, work part-time when their children are young, or have to adjust, as I said, for sort of the school period and holiday period. It's I should just mention in passing, sort of the employment rate of mothers drops very significantly over school holidays, because they, particularly if you're in casual work, you don't have paid leave. So people have to take time off, particularly over the Christmas period, but also I believe, I don't have school-age children anymore, but I believe at the moment it's schools breaking up. So while a lot of people can go on holidays, a lot of people can't afford to go on holidays, so they're at home with their children, and employment drops. So there's the situation has become, I think, superficially in terms of employment, it looks better, but there are new pressures, I think, on families with children, particularly low-income families with children.
Thanks, Peter. And Pauline, much of the as a sole parent and advocate, much of what Bettina and Peter were pointing out, you'd be aware of. But what do you think some of the consequences are of not addressing the intersections of work, care, and social security?
One of the big things that I think a lot of people don't tend to think about, being a sole parent and on New Start, there is that perception that I'm lazy and that I don't work, is that apart from that attitude is the rate of money that I lose. And I mean, yes, we all have costs associated with working, transport. I'm in a situation where I either drive an hour. At the moment, I'm casual and I work all over Brisbane. So I either drive an hour with petrol prices at just over $2 a litre, or I take in 2.5 hours each way. So I add an extra 5 hours to my day. It's the effect on the children. Oops, what happened there?
We can hear you, Pauline.
Oh, I'm very sorry. It dropped out on me for some reason. My apologies.
No, I think we've lost Pauline. Have we lost Pauline? We might come back to Pauline while she reconnects as part of the challenge of doing this.
Could I just reinforce some of the points made by Bettina about, Pauline's back.
That's okay, go for it, Peter.
No,
go for it.
No, how about you continue what you were saying, Pauline, and we'll come back to Peter.
I mean, the consequences are, I mean, apart from as I was saying, the economy, I mean, it proved that over COVID, the extra money helped the economy. But I find that trying to budget from week to week being casual, I lose 60 cents in the dollar off my Centrelink payment. I know people are saying, well, you're working, but my casual wages aren't enough to support us for a week. So not only do I lose tax, not only do I have all the expenses of transporting to and from work, I also lose 60 cents in the dollar off my Centrelink payment. And you just can't make ends meet. I mean, some weeks, for example, this week, I was out of money by Friday. I mean, fortunately, I'd done my shopping, but I got 2 extra shifts called in on the Sunday and the Monday, and I literally prayed all the way home on Monday that I had enough petrol to get home. It's the self-esteem, the feeling like I'm not enough because I'm not coping, I'm not being able to balance everything. It's, you know, coming home, I get home after driving an hour and a half in traffic because it takes longer to get home than it does to get to work. I come home and half the time I'm having a nap. So some nights I don't even get to see my daughter. The effects that it's having on just lifestyle. And everybody's entitled to have a lifestyle, not just to survive.
Exactly. And I suppose a very important role that you have is actually to be a parent and to have the time to look after your child as well.
I mean, I'm fortunate that I have an older son, although he does have autism. He's quite low on the spectrum, but he picks up a lot more slack with my 11-year-old daughter than he ever should. You know, Peter mentioned, you know, the parents not working over holidays. I'm not surprised. It can cost you $50 a day plus for holiday care. And people go, but there's holiday care, you know, you can still work. Sometimes you'll pay more for a holiday care if they're doing an excursion. You have to pay for an excursion as well as the care for the day. You can actually pay out more for the care than you do you make, especially if you're a casual worker. That not having a regular income just makes it so much hard to balance anything. And a budget is week to week because you just can't plan ahead.
Exactly. So we know some of the impacts, some of the history. What are some of the priority changes that the government and others, like employers, could make to improve economic security for those most at risk of poverty? What would help? Who would like to? Peter?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, following on from what Bettina had said earlier, there are sort of at least 3 or maybe 4 major changes that have occurred in social security policy. It sort of started in 2006 with the Howard government, so that new people who came on to needed to apply for social security benefits after that, that if they were a lone parent, as Bettina said, and their youngest child was 8, they had to receive New Start, now Job Seeker. So there were the new recipients received much lower levels of payments. They receive more than single people. They receive about, I think, about $40 more. But what also happened in 2009 was the Rudd government very significantly increased age pensions and disability and carers payments, but they didn't include lone parents in that. So the gap now between even the slightly higher amount of money that lone parents are getting if they're on parenting payment and what they would have received if they'd continued to be treated in the same way as pensioners, I think it's about $8,000 a year. So it's very substantial. And of course, if you're that's parent. That's the difference between job seeker and pensions. In addition, the parenting payment is no longer indexed to wages, and as Bettina said, it's indexed to prices. As Bettina said, also family payments, the link between the rate of family payments and the pension rates was also broken. And in addition, at different times, different governments since then have not indexed the family payment. They've paused the indexation. So there's this sort of reduction in the rate of family payments, and these both the changes in indexation and changes in rates of income support payments. So what that's meant is that while there are more people, more low-income families in employment than in the past, those who haven't been able to find employment are a lot worse off than if the previous policies had continued. So I think, given that the people who need to use the social security system and don't have other income are the poorest, that's where I would put some of the priority, but also the issues that Pauline just mentioned. I mean, it's very interesting that the opposition proposed in the last couple of days that age pensioners be allowed to have twice the free area that they currently have, so that they can, I think it'd be about, go from $180 to $360 a fortnight before their payment starts to be reduced. But they were only talking about age pensioners, whereas, I mean, why not include all the other people on social security benefits as well?
Can I
yes, Bettina,
add to that? A very important analysis of the Hilda data by Professor Wilkins of the Melbourne Institute found very recently, I mean, we heard him give the paper very recently, that there has been a deep erosion in the well-being of sole parents and therefore their children over 2 decades. And he did a decomposition in a whole range of areas, not only materially, but also in terms of physical and mental health and other indicators of well-being. And he did a decomposition analysis which showed that apart from the low income link in both the 2-couple and the sole parent families, he concluded that it was income support policy changes that are primarily responsible for the decrease in well-being of sole parents and their children over 2 decades. So if I were looking at priorities, I would say it is, of course, extremely important to look at the rate and the income testing and the work testing regime of job seeker. But if we're concentrating, focusing on parents with children, we must also be looking at the adequacy of the rates of parenting payment, the ways in which parenting payment is indexed, and whether it's indexed to community living standards, as it now doesn't appear to be. In addition, what we consider to be the ages of children at which a draconian change in receipt of income support takes place. As a sole parent living in Canberra, in an article in The Guardian, which I read recently just after the election of the Labor government, as this article says, the sole parent, the mother said, because they're over 8, do they eat less? Do they require less? I can see Pauline nodding. In other words, do we have an income support policy that is actually concerned with the well-being of children? That's a really important issue. So it's the rate and the conditions of parenting payment. It's also the rates and the indexation of family tax benefit parts A and B, which are often neglected in the whole story, although they actually, as Pauline will know, constitute a significant proportion of the total amount of money that sole parents and low-income couple parents receive. But what we haven't mentioned yet, as I'm sure Pauline will agree, Peter will agree, is housing. The Labor government has indicated that it would build 20,000 more units, social housing units, and 10,000 more affordable homes. This is crucial for sole parent families. That requires affordable housing and secure housing, often because of the difficult circumstances from which sole parents come. So I'd be focusing on that, but I'd also want to focus on the nature of labour market programs. It's my understanding, and Pauline could tell us more, that Parents Next, I believe, as it is called, can bring very harsh penalties for alleged parent non-compliance. And this, in the broadest sense, disrespects care. The point I think Peter's making, that is that this is an added time stress, and it needs to be understood in those terms. I'm far from downplaying the importance of increasing the capacities of low-income sole parents and low-income couple parents to be able to access decent, well-paid jobs, which are flexible. The issue of flexibility is so important to enable the other huge and magnificent role of childcare to be fully carried out. That's where I'd be looking. That's a big agenda, but it would be very important for a new government to return to the vision of the 1980s and ask where a poverty reduction policy for families with children should move.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Bettina. We've sort of laid out a roadmap, drawing on lessons on the past. What about you, Pauline, before we open up to questions? There are quite a few coming in. What do you think are the priority changes that need to be made?
Don't start me on rent assistance and affordable housing. They're actually building, I believe it's about 110 new units in the area that I'm in. It's a drop in the bucket. I know when you hear 20,000 and 10,000, people go, oh, great. It's a drop in the bucket. For example, I live in a very old house. The veranda is unsafe to the point where if I move out, they will not be able to re-rent this house until there's some major construction. But it is cheap compared to the area I live in, and rents are going up by 100 to 150 on average a week. People have been living in houses for a couple of years, and all of a sudden they've got to come up with an extra $100 a week. And I've got couples that are working. So rent assistance would be one. But in all honesty, when you talk about when they took parents off parenting payment when children turned 8, 72% of sole parents were either working or studying when they cut their payments. And some of them, I know myself, mine was cut by $200 at the time. They need to make these things more realistic. If you're working, support you to stay in work. For example, as I was saying, with all the travel costs, paying tax and losing 60 cents in the dollar, they need to make these things more realistic to support you to stay in work and to support you to stay in study. I've stopped study twice over the years. My son is in his early 30s. Twice I started university and couldn't continue to live. I had to quit and go and get a job. It needs to be more support so that you can stay in long-term study or long-time employment.
Yeah, and certainly, as Bettina was talking about, the JET program, which helped so many people to get qualifications so that they could be in stable, decent employment and build some financial security for themselves and their children, rather than short-term, casual work or courses that won't lead to financial security. We've got some questions, so I might go to them, open them up, and we'll see. Now, goodness me. I'll start it from the top. I think. So Andy asks, evidence shows that paid in full and on time child support has the capacity to reduce poverty by 21%. Given that we have 1.7 billion outstanding in child support payments, does this evidence suggest an important policy action? Now, who would like to tackle that about child support? Okay, going to you, Pauline.
Oh, here we go. We prepared for an hour or two. I've been in situations, both my children, there is almost 23 years difference between the children, so they have separate fathers. Both of them have not paid on time, have not paid at all. My daughter's father worked out that if you don't pay anything for 3 months, or you're more than 3 months behind, they garnish your wages. So he'd wait through, wouldn't pay anything for 3 months, and then offer to pay an extra $20 a week. He'd make one payment and then wouldn't pay for another 2 or 3 months. He's also he's now in a good job, but he's got a fringe benefits claim where he can actually do his overtime and call outs, which equates to about $40,000 or $50,000 a year for him. He hides that in fringe benefits and doesn't have to pay child support on that. I've seen a few American Judge Judy type shows, and in America, if the other parent does not pay child support, it is actually a legal process and they can actually be charged and their wages garnished. I think there should be far more of that for the other parent, and unfortunately in a lot of cases it's men that are in decent jobs and they get exemptions for domestic violence, or they just don't pay, and then they wait until the child's over 18 and then they claim hardship, and the parent never ever gets that support that they were entitled to for the child.
Anyone else like to make a comment? Or will we go on to another question?
I would only like to make the comment based on Roger Wilkins' analysis. He found over the 2 decades of the Hilda study that the amount of child support received had been going down. I hope that those of you who saw that video agree that I'm remembering correctly. And whilst the matters that Pauline sets out as so critical, it's also possible that if there is low income in the couple family of origin before the sole parent family is formed, where that is the case, then that can reduce the amount of income available for the non-custodial parent to pay in child support. I'm in no way suggesting that I attribute these changes only to that, but it seems to me that we need to be carefully examining all the other enabling policies that are crucial for enhancing the well-being of low-income parents and their children and sole parents and their children, certainly not to diminish what Pauline has told us.
Can I make one other small comment? Another policy change. With the Act for Child Support, it actually gives you the minimum amount required, and most men sorry, I'm saying men because of my experience, most men pay that. It is actually in the Act, it says for housing, clothing, and basic necessities. With child support, if you actually look at the true nature of the act, not only should they be paying that child support, the other parent should be paying that child support, they should also be paying for half of school fees, half of any extracurricular activities. I think it needs to be changed, that needs to actually be set down in writing, that the other parent contributes to all these extracurricular activities. I mean, I have a creative daughter. She's done dance. She's currently doing music, and it's what she loves. It's what brings a sparkle to her eye. So I work so I can afford those things, but under no circumstances would her biological father contribute to those unless he was forced to. It needs to be set out more clearly that the other parent should be contributing to the child's extracurricular activities, not just maintaining a roof over their head and food in their mouth, because that's not all a child needs. A child needs more than just food and a roof over their head.
Could I just say, Dina, that I noticed in the chat that Tony Wren said that the Howard government watered down the original child support legislation, and the formulae that had been developed by Emeritus Edwards for the Labor government and to Brian Howe in the Hawke and Keating period. And therefore, that's another issue that could be put on the table, and Tony Wren might have something to say. I know that's not my job to facilitate, but she did put it in the chat.
Yeah, it's certainly something we might follow up. I think we might go to another question though, which is a bit more kind of broader. This is from Tony Hansen from the Equality Rights Alliance, just to distinguish her from the other Tony. Understanding the budget environment, what would each of you nominate as the simplest but single biggest change the Albanese government could make that advances the welfare and health of women and children and can be shown to help the budget bottom line in the long term? There's a real issue of how do we balance, it's a tight fiscal environment, how do we balance the priorities? Perhaps, Bettina, would you like to go first?
Yes. I would always say that both movement into paid work in the best possible forms of paid work for parents with children is absolutely crucial. That also requires that the income support should be one that maintains proper support for the parents and their children in making that transition, which requires sensible, as Peter says, sensible income testing, not draconian income testing, as is the case, for example, with JobKeeper, but income testing which enables that transition and maintenance of good, adequate paid work to be maintained by parents. I think that what happened with JET was that parents back in the 1990s, from 1989, were enabled to take long-term education and training programs, not short-term 3-month projects, but long-term education and training programs which had qualifications connected with them, which enabled entry into decent work with flexible conditions. I think that that's crucial, but it's also crucial that that movement into paid work, the movement into education and training and paid work, be supported by the best possible income support, namely forms of parenting payment, which are not created so as to move out of synchronicity with community living standards, as they currently are.
Mm. And what about the argument that, there's budget constraints and we can't afford it?
Well, budget constraints in work that Peter and I have done together, you can look at the short term and you can look at the long term, and increasing flexible, good labour force participation rates, of course, on the part of women, which is part of the new government's philosophy, of course, reduces budget costs. It increases the tax take. Over the long term, it diminishes the need for social security, but you can't do that with drastic one-off moves that have heavy penalties associated with them. They must be done in a way which enhances the sole parent and the couple parents' labour force capacity over the long term.
Thanks, Bettina. Peter.
Yeah, I just wanted to make two related observations, just to reinforce the point Bettina's been making about employment. So while the employment rates of lone parents in Australia and women more generally have increased very significantly, if you look at the OECD family database, as I do on a regular basis, the employment rate of lone parents and lone mothers in Australia is still the third lowest in the OECD. The OECD average is over 70%, and the best performing countries, unsurprisingly, like Sweden, have an employment rate of 80%. But to get to that sort of level of employment, you have to have a lot of infrastructure in terms of childcare, preschool. One of the original questions about that was, I think, the initiative by the New South Wales and the Victorian government is incredibly important, but it's only part of the story. So you need to have that, both the positive childcare, preschool, labour market programs that focus on the long term and not just the short term. So I think, just to reinforce what Bettina said there, but on the budget, I think there's a link between a question I saw in the question and answers by Tony Wren and the one by Tony Hassan about the budget. One of the things that the new Treasurer has indicated is that the budget will have what's called a wellbeing framework. The wellbeing framework is in operation in New Zealand. New Zealand also, as Tony Wren points out, has a child poverty, has explicit child poverty pledges as part, which is sort of separate but related to their wellbeing framework. In the wellbeing framework, I think there is a potential for creating a framework that really makes sure that with the budget pressures that we have, which are, I think, absolutely real, that we also focus on making sure that whatever the impact of those of budgets for hopefully forever, looks at fairness. So say, for example, there was a wellbeing framework in the budgets from about 2003, actually also introduced by the Howard government when Ken Henry was Secretary of the Treasury. I think that was continued. Strangely enough, it was the 2014 budget or 2015 where they stopped doing it. So the fairness, the wellbeing framework that we're now re-importing from New Zealand, we exported to them first. But I think we need to be very precise about it. We want to look at the distributional impact of budget changes and be able to judge whether we think they're fair or not. So I think that in future budgets, we need to have that framework of being able to assess who wins and who loses. All budgets involve winners and losers by definition. And when you create a budget, when the Treasury does the budget papers, while there's a lot of give and take in these estimates, if you're introducing a program that has a cost, you have to have both the average benefit to people and the total number of people affected. If you're introducing a saving, by definition, the Treasury has to know how many people there are affected by it and how much they lose. I mean, yeah, so the distribution is central to budget analysis. It's just we don't usually talk about it. We just talk about the deficit, right? So I think that developing the sort of not only the gender lens on the budget, but the fairness lens on the budget is really important in the sort of many difficult decisions that the current government has inherited and that is facing in terms of the need to spend more in lots and lots and lots of different areas.
Thanks, Peter. There's another question, and for us working in the community services sector, how can we best advocate for better social security for low-income families? There's been long advocacy in recent years, but with not so much success. So any suggestions? How about you start, Paulene?
I think just talking about it, people being aware of it. There was a big push to demonise those on social security, and I believe it was a targeted push because at the time, the government at the time was trying to reduce a lot of Centrelink payments and was trying to, what's the word I'm looking for, trying to get support for that. Talking about it, talking to anyone you need. I've been fortunate enough that I have gotten in with some groups and doing some advocacy. I was able to go to Canberra with ACOS, the Council of Australian Social Services, just before they raised the last rate. We literally walked around Parliament House knocking on the doors of the politicians and saying hello and talking to those that had the time. Many of them would have spoken to us, but they didn't get the time. It's talking, it's being an advocate, it's talking to people in business, talking to people in government. Word of mouth can sometimes be the cheapest and most effective way to advocate for people.
What about you, Peter and Bettina? Any ideas for more effective influencing?
What interests me is a much better community understanding of what poverty, low income, scrabbling for work, being penalised for not being able to get into work actually mean. The Gittins wrote a piece in the Herald, Sydney Morning Herald, just after the election, saying it's time to act kindly towards the unemployed. That very notion of kindness in public policy and Peter's view of requiring an equality lens, a distributional lens on budget changes are so important. The demonising not only of people without jobs, but of sole parents themselves, and particularly those without jobs, must stop. And it can only stop when the policies are put in place. In other words, policies themselves gather their own adherents, their own advocates. If you could move towards understanding the ways in which good forms of income support and proper forms of jobs, education and training programs which do not stigmatise and do not sanction can in fact result in sole parents and low-income parents with children moving into jobs, that's so absolutely crucial to the well-being of their children. I think that the communal advocacy must focus on the transfer of low-income and disadvantage to children and how the health impacts, both physical and emotional, on both the parent and the child is so crucial to a healthy Australia. And that seems to me to matter enormously in advocacy.
Thanks, Bettina. Last word to you, Peter, I think.
All right. I was just going to, there's a, in the chat, Marcus Banks made the comment about the social wage. I agree entirely. I think sort of what the government, new government has indicated that it has priorities for are childcare, aged care, disability care, and other things. But I think that Bettina and a number of us of a certain age will remember that the Labor government, when it came in the 1980s, really emphasised the social wage. The context was different because we had extremely high and rising unemployment at the time. But I think that we need to think about the social wage, and we need to think in this sort of fairness lens that I think that we also need to bring back. I mean, the point Pauline made as well, I think, is really important, is that this demonisation of people on welfare, it's a sort of, the reason for it is we give more of our assistance to low-income people than just about any other social security system in the world. But it creates this sense of them and us, and sort of, and the constant niggling at the budget without trying to, even though there've been cuts in assistance for lone parents that are very significant, and the shift of people from disability payments onto job seeker is also very important. But we haven't gone too far down that path. But the sort of constant looking for savings and demonising people on social security payments, I mean, the logical consequence of that was robo-debt, right? And if you look at that, I think it is the most spectacular example of a failure of public administration in this country that I can remember. And so this sort of constant making it them and us leads to disastrously bad public policy.
Thanks, Peter. We're coming to an end. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. Certainly it shows that, to address poverty, it's more than just a job. You have to have decent work, fair and adequate income support, affordable housing, childcare, and other social infrastructure, or as Marcus says, a social wage. Thank you all for the discussion and for taking part in this. And you can follow us on Twitter. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to panelists, Dina, BSL, and our audience.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.